This is the last video for Era 4's political elements focusing on Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the first Democratic president of the Democratic Party, and which is part of the second party system between the Democrats and the Whigs. He serves 2 terms in office, and his presidency covers a lot of really important information. And the best way to remember that is to think about the New York KNICKS, KNICKS. That's how I remember the key elements of Andrew Jackson. So let's get started. The first K stands for his kitchen cabinet, and the kitchen cabinet is, a derogatory term against his official cabinet, or the official cabinet of presidencies, the office of Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Secretary of the Treasury. The kitchen cabinet is the informal entrance to the House. So this was Jackson's informal group of advisors. And these advisors were mainly newspaper editors, old friends, and longtime political supporters. They often supported Jackson, helped draft his policies, gave political advice, and were often very vocal in supporting his policies. The kitchen cabinet was rather criticized because it was a divergence from what previous presidents had done, and so his opponents, people against Jackson, often criticized his use of informal advisors, and you can see that example through the political cartoon on your screen there. It's making fun of Jackson's cabinet, showing the chaos and fighting as being acceptable within the Jackson administration, and saying clearly the message is, this is chaotic, this is not right. The next element of Jackson's presidency is nullification. But to understand the nullification crisis, we need to review some tariffs. So a tariff, as we know, is a tax on imported goods. Tariffs are popular in the Northeast and the Midwest. Why? In the Northeast and the Midwest are emerging areas of manufacturing and trade. Tariffs are hated by southern states and western states. Why? Well, southern and western states tended to import manufactured goods more than buying goods from northern states. They were also fearful of retaliatory tariffs, of tariffs being slapped on southern exports in different countries. So if the South is exporting tobacco to France, they're fearful that France is going to pass tariffs on the American tobacco, and it's going to raise the price there, and they're not going to sell as much. Okay? So the issue of tariffs in the 1830s is an incredibly hot topic, and that leads to the nullification crisis. Nullification is the ability for states to nullify or declare unconstitutional a law passed by the federal government. This theory was first used and developed in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions against the Alien and Sedition Acts under the Adams administration. And so the events. So South Carolina nullified the tariffs of 1828 and also in 1832. So in 1832, Jackson is president. And Jackson believes in the power of the Union. He believes in federal supremacy when it comes to states. He's still an advocate of states' rights, but when it comes to national issues, such as tariffs, clearly defined as a power of the federal government, Jackson believes in absolute power of the Union. And so when he sees that South Carolina has nullified that tariff, he gets really ticked off. And he actually orders the military to enforce tariff collection in South Carolina. Like, he's going to mobilize troops and enforce them to collect the taxes. South Carolina gets pretty freaked out, and we're almost on the brink of war, actually, in that point. Henry Clay, our great compromiser of Era 4, offers a solution called the olive branch and the sword. The olive branch, the peacemaking idea, was to pass a new tariff of 1833 that would gradually lower the tariff rates back down to levels that were acceptable to southern states. The sword piece was the force bill, and that asserts the president's authority to use the military to collect tariffs. So a peaceful opportunity and an enforcement act as well. And South Carolina accepts the new tariff of 1833. But what this demonstrates is Jackson's belief and use of force and power of the office of the presidency. Another way that Jackson greatly increased the power of the presidency is through Indian removal. So for context, remember that cotton is rapidly expanding in the Southwest, and I mean areas of Alabama, specifically Georgia and Mississippi. Americans are hungry to buy land, and they want to buy this land that is technically owned by Native Americans. So in 1830, Jackson passes the Indian Removal Act, which required natives to cede, to give up lands in existing states and settle westward of the Mississippi River, like to Oklahoma, for example. Many of these Native American tribes were upset and looked to the Supreme Court for help. The Supreme Court case Worcester v. Georgia ruled that Cherokee land is protected by federal treaty and that Georgia could not remove Native Americans from their state. Again, this asserts federal supremacy over state laws. Jackson, however, because he's a Southerner and because he also supports the common man who needs farming, needs new farming land, he's going to want Indians to be removed. And so he refuses to protect the Cherokees in Georgia, and he actually enforces the Indian Removal Act and uses the United States military to forcibly remove the Cherokees from Georgia, which is known as the Trail of Tears, beginning in 1835. In the Trail of Tears, over 100,000 Native Americans will forcibly be moved west, and before the Civil War, over 100 million acres will be signed away through treaties that the United States government forces Native Americans to agree to. C stands for the common man. The common man, it represents the ideals very similar to Jefferson, where Jackson portrays himself as a common man, and most of the people in the United States during this time period are farmers. So Jackson emphasizes his humble upbringing, working hard, and his efforts in the war. He advocates for what we call universal white male suffrage, which is a term you definitely want to have in your notes. Universal white male suffrage is the ability for all white males to vote. So in 1824, only 10% of white males could actually vote, and that's because they're based on property requirements. They have to own property. By 1840, the end of the period, 70% of white males are able to vote. So again, this universal white male suffrage is a common expansion of democracy, yet it's only an expansion of democracy for white men. K stands for kill the bank. So we've talked about the Bank of the United States and that it was first chartered for 20 years and dies in 1811. Well, after the War of 1812, Madison recognizes the importance of a bank and agrees to pass a new bill, so he creates the Second Bank of the United States. In 1819, the state of Maryland tried to pass a tax over the Bank of the United States. So that went to the Supreme Court in the case McCulloch v. Maryland, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Bank of the United States was legal, it was constitutional, that states can't tax a federal institution, and it also affirms federal supremacy. It affirms and upholds federal law supersedes state law. So state law is below federal law. Jackson, however, really still hates the bank. He believes that the bank favors the wealthy and not the common man. He believes that the bank is unconstitutional, and he wants to get rid of it. That's his whole point. So he does that in an opportunity he has in 1832. Henry Clay puts forth a bill to recharter the bank. thinking that in 1832 it's an election year and Jackson would just have to accept it. However, Jackson actually vetoes the bill, which kills the bank, and he also orders that the Secretary of the Treasury takes out all of the federal money held in the second bank and place it in state-owned banks, thus killing the second bank of the United States. And it's never rechartered again. This political cartoon is one of my absolute all-time favorites. Here on the right, you can see General Jackson, on the left, General Jackson trying to slay the many-headed monster, which is the Bank of the United States, led by this guy, Nicholas Biddle. Major Downing, was kind of a representation at the time of the common man, is trying to kill the many-headed monster, the many-headed branches of the banks. Our last piece is the spoils system. So the spoils system, or party patronage, is giving government jobs for party loyalty. And Jackson really believed in party loyalty, so he fired all of the appointed federal government appointments that were non-Democrats, non-supporters of Jackson, and replaced them with loyal Democrats. The effects of this is that the inexperienced often got government positions, which, the lack of inexperience means that they don't know how things run, they don't know the process or all of the government intricacies that are required to get things done in a bureaucracy. And this also heavily emphasizes party loyalty over actual ability. And to some extent, the spoils system still exists today. There's political appointees in any administration, and then there's merit-based appointees. Most jobs in the United States government today are based on merit. You have to demonstrate your ability to do the job. Some top positions like secretary positions and deputy secretary positions are political appointments and are still rewarded and given based on loyalty as well. So that's all you need to know about Jefferson. Just remember KNICKS. Have a good day.